Friday, welcome back to Precinct Omega Towers. It's my live stream session for the week. And I try to find something new and different to talk about every week. Sometimes it's hobbies, sometimes it's demo games, sometimes we'll be talking about game design or whatever. This week, I wanted to talk about what these days seems to be called lore. When I was starting in the hobby, we called it fluff. And I'm comfortable with the term fluff, I'll be honest. Fluff is the opposite to crunch. And when you're talking about a game, we know what we mean. Crunch is the rules of the game, and fluff is what provides those rules context. I don't mind people want to call it fluff, but these days people call it lore. Lore, that kind of lore. I don't know how I feel about the word lore, especially when it's applied to Horizon Wars. Lore kind of implies something static and unchangeable. And one thing which is absolutely definitely true about the Horizon Wars fluff is that it is neither static nor changeable. I basically wrote the Horizon Wars story in a single setting, that I sat down at my computer and I blitzed through the setting and the narrative for Horizon Wars in one go. And what I was trying to achieve was really very, very limited. I wanted to give Horizon Wars some context. I wanted to make clear that that context was there to enable the player, not to constrain them. And I wanted it to be clear that the context was not intended to be taken seriously. Those were my three desires. So the first one is to provide some context. And I think games thrive in context. There are a lot of, not even tabletop miniatures games, all kinds of tabletop games they're engaging, they're entertaining, they're exciting, they're fun, but if you took away their context, even though it wouldn't actually influence the mechanics of the game at all, the game would lose something important. And we can look at straightforward abstract games, look at Carcassonne, look at Splendor, look at Sushi Go, for heaven's sake. Even yesterday I visited some friends in their garden. I have had my jab, by the way. Ooh, that still hurts a bit. Can you see the point? I've had my COVID jab. I got the Moderna vaccine this week. I am over 45, and I've had no real side effects. My arm hurts, where the puncture wound went in. I was fine. So if you have a chance to get the vaccine, please do. I just wanted to say that. Anyway, yesterday I went round to some friend's house. We played a game called Herd Mentality in the garden. And we were wearing all of our coats and drinking hot drinks, but we played Herd Mentality. And Herd Mentality is a party game, and it's got almost no context, but the one context it does have is it is cow themed. The points, counters all have pictures of cows on them, all of the cows have different expressions, and there's a squidgy pink cow in the game. And the cow gives the game some context, and it's valuable. Now, of course, a game like Herd Mentality, you could play it without the context. You could play it without the cows. It would still be a fun game, but the cows give it something. Now, when we get away from abstract tabletop games to something as what's the word? Simulationist, as a miniatures war game, then immediately the context becomes vital. And one of the things that has made a game like Warhammer 40,000 the industry dominator that it is its context. Its setting, its history, its deep lore, its many factions, its amazing artwork, its fantastic fiction. All of it has contributed to the success of Warhammer 40,000. But Warhammer 40,000 was successful from the very start on the basis of its lore. Anybody who picked up Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader back in the early days in 1984, I think it was, will have been captured by the imagery and the gothic intensity of the lore. Now, the lore then was providing context, it was not seeking to constrain the players, and it was not intended to be taken seriously. And as Warhammer 40,000 evolved, and this is not just true of them, but it is the acme of examples, so the Warhammer 40,000 lore has become increasingly constraining. Because increasingly, the market has grown, and Games Workshop is very keen that people continue to play their games with their miniatures, because they are a miniatures company. That's how they make money. So they have sought to constrain players more and more with the lore. The advantage of nailing down things like the Horus Heresy, that was extremely vague for most of the time that I was playing Warhammer 40,000, the advantage to nailing it down was that it created a new product line that could then be exploited. And in Warhammer 30,000, the Forge World product line, you've now got specific named characters, you've got specific events, you've got specific chapter stories, that things that happen to the different legions, and the emphasis is now on trying to constrain the player through the lore, which I think is a great shame. And the other thing that Warhammer 40,000 has lost, although it occasionally shows signs of recapturing it, is the fact that it was never intended to be taken seriously. It is bombastic and exaggerated and unnecessarily overblown. It is taking swipes at fascism and at religion and at extremist government and social inequality and racism. It's all in there in satirical form in the original setting. But as the game matured and the company grew more corporate, so it has lost that sense of satire. And that is one of the things that has made 40k lore now a tool available for people on the extreme ends of the political spectrums to recruit and to portray themselves in what they think are favourable terms, instead of realising that they're actually painting themselves with the brush that was designed to paint fascists. And they haven't noticed. So, to wind it back to Horizon Wars, that was just a sort of the context of Horizon Wars was always supposed to be mutable. It was supposed to not constrain. It was supposed to allow people who already had 6 mil armies, 2 mil, 4 mil, 10 mil, whether you had Dystopian Wars or Drop Zone Commander or Battletech or Mech Warrior or Dreampod 9, what's it called? Heavy Gear, Blitz, whatever you already had, it wanted you to be able to find a place within the setting that you could justify using what you already owned. That was all it was for. It was not to constrain you, and it was not to be taken seriously. In fact, it was specifically written as... I'm not sure I deserve to call it satire. I am not a satirist. But it was written as a joke. The Horizon Wars setting was always supposed to be funny, and darkly funny. I won't because it's a war. I mean, this is one of the things. The reason. Let's start talking about it. We start in the timeline in 2116, which is exactly 100 years after the first book was due to be published. Hence 2116. It's the only reason it was 2116. And in 2116, the British government has what appears to the outside world to be a mental breakdown, a collective mental breakdown, and it orders an invasion of France. Through the decommissioned Channel Tunnel and into Calais, with a force of battle mechs. And they claim that they are there in Operation Plantagenet to reclaim the historic seceded holdings of the English crown. And this is why it's called Plantagenet. The Plantagenet monarchs of England owned a good deal more of France than the King of France. It's a historical peculiarity. It's a fantastic story. It's got almost nothing to do with modern nationhood. It is a ludicrous claim. It is an intentionally ludicrous claim. And it was intended to satirize the historical revisionists on all over the world that lean on centuries or even millennia old changes in leadership to claim modern territorial rights, which are nonsensical. So that was the number one. It was supposed to be ludicrous, and the reason I wrote it as Britain was because I didn't want to be pointing the finger at anybody in the world as a catalyst for international conflict. I didn't want that to be something that anybody could accuse me of doing, and so I thought it seemed fair to point the finger at myself as a British person. And of course, not long after that, we then had the referendum, and we had Brexit, and we had the rise of outright politics in the UK. I didn't foresee any of that. I wasn't writing Horizon Wars thinking I can see a future with a rise of the outright and a return to British isolationism. It wasn't intentional. Does it, however, satirise those things as well? Yes, it does. And now that it does, I'm going to embrace it. And that's what I mean about the law for Horizon Wars not being fixed. Now nobody's. I've only got one viewer. I'm just checking that I am on. I've had a couple of people who sort of popped in and disappeared again. So maybe I'm being boring this week, but I am going to talk about law. So it starts with Operation Plantagenet, and the idea is that Operation Plantagenet stumbles out of control, and various other nations use the opportunity to make their own ludicrous territorial claims. The Argentinians reclaim the Falkland Islands, the Greeks reclaim the sovereign base areas, the Turks try to reclaim the whole of Cyprus. All of that explodes. And nuclear weapons get involved, and the world tears itself apart. And again, this is supposed to be satire. It is, at best, a cautionary tale. The idea that the law of unintended consequences applies always, and especially to conflict, and especially to war. Now, a nuclear war isn't funny, but it is definitely a worthy topic of satire. If you've ever seen Whoops Apocalypse, it is worth your viewing. It's quite an old movie now, and it's got many, many, many things wrong with it. But in terms of watching a world stumble accidentally into a nuclear conflict, that's probably the sort of the apotheosis of that idea. And that's more or less the start of the Horizon War story. The world rips itself apart. And at that point, I wouldn't say that's the end of the satire, but after that, it kind of becomes a little bit of more of a cautionary tale than it does an explicit satire. Now, there's a feature of the early story in Horizon Wars that a lot of people kind of gloss over and don't really pay attention to, but I would like to draw people's attention to now, because it's going to become bigger and more important to the story as it unfolds, which is the Gestalt worker movement. The Gestalt worker movement is an idea inspired by the work of Douglas Hofstadter, amongst others. And it's the idea that true artificial general intelligence is much, much harder than we kind of think it is. We're getting good at artificial intelligence these days. I mean, Horizon War Zero Dark has an artificial intelligence system in its playing cards. There's an artificial intelligence system in Infinite Dark as well, and there will be one in Midnight Dark when we get to that in a couple of years. I mean, it's already the draft of it can be found in Over the Horizon now. And that's an artificial intelligence system, in that it is a system that is designed to create an artificial impression of intelligence in the behaviour of the opposing forces. I've had a comment from Dale. Late. Oh, okay, that's good. The way people have been coming in and out, Dale, I've been worried that there was something wrong, and I think it's just that I'm boring. So welcome. I was worried that my microphone wasn't on or something, but I've checked it and it seems to be. Okay, good. Where was I? Yeah, Gestalt worker movement. So when we talk about artificial intelligence now, what we're really sort of talking about is machine learning, which can give the illusion of intelligent behaviour, but in a very, very limited framework. And driverless cars is a good example. You know, your driverless cars are going to be able to eventually take you safely from place A to place B, no dramas, and they'll park and they'll recharge and they'll do all those things, but they are not going to come into your house and cook you a souffle. They aren't going to read you a bedtime story that they've written themselves. You know, I suppose you could combine different forms of artificial intelligence to do those discrete things, but eventually there's going to be a limit to what an artificial intelligence can do. It will reach a point where you go, oh yes, it's just a machine. Artificial general intelligence, meanwhile, yep, good. Artificial general intelligence is an artificial human mind. And back in the 1970s, a man called Douglas Hofstadter wrote a book called Gödel Escher Bach that has sort of really been transformative in my thinking. And one of the points that he made was to illustrate the sheer density of processing power that is necessary to attain artificial general intelligence. Now, he didn't use those terms writing in the 70s, but he did make several predictions about the emergence of true general intelligence in an artificial framework that basically said the network would have to be incomprehensibly massive. I mean, in the 70s, he was talking about frameworks that were incomprehensibly massive even by our standards in 2021, which, you know, I mean, it was incredibly prescient and has proved to be incredibly correct. So my idea, I wanted to have true artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence in the setting, but I couldn't see a way to justify it being a thing even in 100 years' time. I didn't believe it would work. But I came up with the idea of the Gestalt worker movement, and the idea of a Gestalt worker movement is that people literally put their heads together, that you can connect multiple brains on a network, and those brains work collectively on a variety of computational tasks that aren't just about number crunching, that use functions of human intuition and experience and learning and all those good human qualities that we can't get into an AI to think in a way that a human brain on its own cannot do. And I mean, I've written all kinds of fiction about the Gestalt worker movement that hasn't been published, hasn't been released. I've got a very sort of clear idea in my mind of how it evolved in the setting. But what it created was something called the melds, and this was unexpected by the designers, but would have been expected if they had read Hofstadter, because one of the things that he talks about in Gödel Escher Bach is what are called emergent properties. The idea that when you have a sufficiently complex system, things arise from it unexpectedly. And his whole example about that is that human intelligence is an emergent property from the increasing complexity of the brain. That's the fundamental core of his argument. And the logical extrapolation from that is that artificial general intelligence would only emerge from an equally complex system. So when you tie brains together, my thinking was, if you get enough brains connected in one of these melds, the idea was that a true general intelligence would accidentally emerge. So that the owners of those minds would no longer be themselves until they left the merge. And while they were in the merge, the meld, they would simply be a facet of a greater intelligence. And I wondered about how that intelligence would want to interact with the world. And this is where we're sort of talking about cautionary tales rather than satire, because the idea, there's a quote, I think it was Churchill, to the extent that if you put powerful men at a table together, all you end up with is the sum of their fears. And the idea that if you put lots of brains together, what you end up with is the sum of their stupidity. So that you get these hyper-capable, hyper-intelligent artificial general intelligences emerging from the meld, but they are fundamentally, they are scared, they are bigoted, they are blind to the obvious, they behave irrationally, and they're brilliant, but they're irrational. And everybody, I think, knows somebody who's brilliant but irrational. So imagine that on the scale of a god, and that's what the melds fundamentally were. They were gods. And there's another idea that sort of led in this direction, which I wish I could remember who said it, but it was this idea that God as a concept isn't something we're coming from, but something we're going towards. Now, as a religious person myself, that isn't something I believe, but I can respect the idea that God is something that exists in our future as humans. And that was something else that sort of fed this idea of the melds, these emergent intelligences in the Gestalt worker movement. And at the time of Operation Plantagenet and the burning, there were dozens, possibly hundreds of melds all over the world. Part of the thing in the setting, which I've not articulated in writing, is that there were legal and illegal melds. So obviously there are legal melds that are put together by participants who sign contracts, who receive compensation for their participation. And basically, if you're a good enough meld member, you can join a meld for 2 to 4 hours a day, and the rest of the day is your own. You don't have to do anything else. You can have a very, very good income and great lifestyle for doing nothing but plugging into a meld. You don't even have to participate. You just loan your brain to the meld, and that's all you need to do. It was, again, the satirical aspect about how our data and privacy is given up to large corporations. But there were also, those were the legal melds, but there would also be illegal melds, that the technology would fall into the hands of criminal groups that would force either their members or kidnap people or members of the communities that they control to participate in criminal melds that would plan criminal activities. And they'd do it with the same levels of viciousness and bigotry and ruthlessness as the criminal members that made them up. Let me spoil things ever so slightly for a future publication. The melds were directly responsible for what happened in Britain and for Operation Plantagenet and consequently for the burning. It was intentional, it was deliberate, it was a plan. The question is not whether they were responsible, which they definitely were. The question is why and who. Was it the legitimate melds? Was it the criminal melds? And what did they hope to gain? Did they plan just Operation Plantagenet, or was the burning as a whole intentional? Did they plan to reduce the world to a semi-irradiated wasteland, to rebuild society from the ground up? Was that their intention? Now, I do know the answers to that question, but I don't plan on answering it just yet. I've got plans for this timeline that are going to go on. But in this case now, we'll move the story forward. So one of the unintended consequences, definite, unintended, I will, again, spoiler, unintended, the males are stupid. I mentioned that. They're phenomenally intelligent, but also very stupid. And they had failed to anticipate the idea that if you precipitate a catastrophically destructive world war with nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, that people will die, and some of those people will be participants in the melds. So the melds suddenly find that they don't have as many brains as they used to. In fact, the number of brains starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point that the melds can no longer operate. That the intelligence that used to make them up evaporates. And at that point, everything is dreadfully, dreadfully wrong. In the setting, then, human society eventually comes to a halt. The war ends. Nation states are destroyed. Borders are meaningless. Life is hard, but society survives, and it begins to rebuild itself in what I call the city-state movement. And this can potentially be seen as a satirical take on isolationist policies of particularly conservative and far-right governments. It wasn't 100% intentional, but it wasn't, again, 100% not intentional. The city-states, I mean, anybody who's read 2000 AD and seen the megacities in 2000 AD, it's not original. I'm not pretending this is new thinking. Necromunda and the hive cities of 40k, very much the same sort of thing. So the city-states are vast, concentrated city spaces, but they're not modern cities. So they're not the sprawling modern urban dump that we've got. Dump in the sense, dumping it out onto the landscape and it just kind of spreads out. So if you imagine something like London, which is not a city-state in the setting. No, I'm lying. No, London is a city-state. So the London city-state is vastly contracted from modern Greater London. Much, much smaller. I mean, not as small as the City of London, but a much smaller space. And the idea is that the city-states have basically, they throw up walls, and they build up and they build down, but they do not build out. Part of the philosophy of the city-states is that humans have damaged the world enough, and they then have to retreat into their city-states, stay in their city-states, and let the world recover and stop messing with it. And there is now, of course, a thing called the rewilding movement. This wasn't a thing when I wrote this setting, not that I was aware of anyway. And there's a lot of the rewilding movement in this period of the setting. The idea that basically humans can manage the redevelopment, they can help, they can thin and cull and replant, but fundamentally the earth has to be allowed to repair itself. And the city-states, the idea is that the city-states are supposed to be nice places to live. They are claustrophobic, they're compressed, there are rich and poor, but basically everybody is provided for. It is a place where there is a universal basic income, everybody eats, everybody has somewhere to live, everybody has a job if they want one, there are plenty of things to do if you don't want one. There's a lot of entertainment resources available, and a big question in the setting, which again I'm deliberately leaving vague, is who is responsible for providing all of this? And it is clear and explicit that it is the Gestalt worker movement, that it is the melds. But there is a question over, are these the same melds? Are these melds that survived the war, or are these completely new melds, rediscovering new identities? And that, again, I don't intend to answer anytime soon, but it is a question that I know the answer to. But the melds are responsible. About melds, they're not the government. These city-states have their own government, but the melds are like the government's key advisor. So no matter who's in charge, no matter what party is there or what political movement has the upper hand, the meld is there to advise and guide and recommend. And because the meld is a gestalt of the citizens of the city-state, each city-state has its own meld, and participation in the meld is mandatory for citizenship. So everybody has to give up at least a couple of hours a day to participate in the meld. The more valuable you are, the more time you give, the more money you receive in return. Inevitably, there are people that do not want to participate in the meld. those people are not entitled to citizenship. As a result, they do not get somewhere to live, they do not get fed, they do not get paid, they do not get covered by the law even. And I am working on a Zero Dark supplement that I had hoped I would be further on with by now, called Antediluvium, which is about those people and their conflict with the rest of society. And that will look more deeply at the nature of the city-states and how they work and how they operate. So there'll be more information coming out about that in Antediluvium in due course. It's a much more cyberpunky environment, but it is cyberpunk, but it's in some ways it's both a more optimistic and a more dystopian vision of cyberpunk, because the corporations are powerful, but they are not all powerful. The meld is all powerful, and the meld is democratic because it has the participation of all of the citizens. But because it's all of the participating citizens that make it up, it is naturally antagonistic to the citizens that do not participate, which makes it dystopic. It's an interesting part of the setting. The city-states exist on Earth for over a century, and the corporations are very big and very powerful, even though they are subordinate to the melds. And there are two corporations that begin to compete. Got a question before I move on. Why would you want to work if you could live and not? Would that not make life descend into anarchy? Oh gosh, Dale, that is such a present question. Yes, the meld. Partly that, but also if you look at modern studies into the universal basic income and test trials that have been done for the UBI, I particularly point you towards the Alaskan trial. Generally speaking, as a rule, people want to work. People want to contribute, want to feel that they are adding to society. Universal basic income provides you with a minimal level of income. If you want a higher level of income, you must work. If you want to feel like you're contributing to society, you must work. But how you work, whether you work as a volunteer, whether you join the police, the military, become a scientist, researcher, writer, game designer, once you've got a universal basic income, those options become more realistic for people. So people work, they just may not work in a way that you would or I would recognise as a salaried job. They may even do multiple different jobs. You might be a part-time artist, part-time police officer, part-time politician, part-time charity worker, part-time street sweeper. Why not? Anyway, there we go. So, two corporations come into conflict. Future Z and Vishnu. And they are the dominant corporations in two separate city-states. Generally speaking, the city-states discourage inter-city communication, but there are train lines that connect the city-states, and there is a very, very limited air travel between the city-states, and it is the corporations that dominate those, because the transport connections of the air transport and the rail transport aren't controlled by the melds, because the melds are resident in the cities. So outside the cities there are no melds. So the corporations control everything outside the cities. So the transport is controlled by them, the research and the development in the recovering world all controlled by the corporations. So they have a very obvious conflict of interest. And if you think such an obvious conflict of interest wouldn't be allowed to exist in a society as idealized as I've described, well, look around at, again, modern corporations and the conflicts of interest. Just look at the current Greenshill investigations going on in Parliament to see how corporations can get away with stuff, which ought to be obvious conflicts of interest. Anyway, Future Z and Vishnu. So Future Z is led by a chap called David Zoon. David Zoon is fixated upon the idea of settling Mars. He is fixated on that idea for one reason and one reason only. He wants a planet of his own that is not controlled by the melds. He'll frame it in other ways. He talks about, wanting to rekindle the spark of human exploration. He wants to talk about ensuring that the human race survives anything catastrophic that happens to Earth again. Having been through the burning, this makes sense. He makes all kinds of lofty claims about what he wants to do, but fundamentally, David Zoon wants a planet. And he made good progress towards that, much to the chagrin of Gideon Wang, head of Vishnu. And Gideon Wang decides that he also wants a planet. He decides he's not going to share Mars with David Zoon, and he's going to take a different planet, and he settles on Venus. One of my biggest struggles in writing the Horizon Wars setting was coming up with some way in which the human settlement of Venus could be in any way feasibly possible. That planet is so ludicrously hostile. It's almost hilarious. But a certain amount of hand waving has to happen with these things. It's not a novel, after all. It's just a setting for a war game. So David Zoon tries to settle Mars. Gideon Wang tries to settle Venus. Very quickly, they discover what a hideous, bottomless pit of investment hell those projects are. And in order to try and shore up the project, they start attacking each other's facilities to steal their resources. And that then leads to what's called the Colonial War. And the Colonial War doesn't last very long as a proper war, partly because Venus is impossible to wage any kind of war on. It's impossible to live there in practical terms, so how you're supposed to actually wage a conflict is beyond me, and it's certainly beyond them. So it mostly takes place on Mars, which means that Vishnu is at a dreadful disadvantage, which means that David Zoon is going to win, but he also is going to go horribly, horribly bankrupt along with the rest of his company, which would leave all of his settlers and colonists utterly high and dry. And at this point, different corporations step in because the apocalypse has been televised. The colonial wars have been the subject of great media interest, and the conflicts on Mars have been broadcast all over the world to all of the surviving city-states, and the indolent and spoilt populations of the city-states find the story of the conflict on Mars absolutely fascinating. And they can't get enough of it, and the media like to make heroes out of the participants and tell stories and narratives, and inevitably they get involved and they start manipulating the story. Now this is, again, not original. You want to watch the movie Wag the Dog for an example. Perfect example of what's going on. This is just a sci-fi version of Wag the Dog. The media basically, when David Zoon can no longer afford to colonize Mars, let alone prosecute a war, the media companies step in and they fund the colonization of Mars, and they fund the continuing conflict. They allow Venus to keep fighting, even though Venus itself is now at peace and the colonization effort is finished, structurally complex though it has turned out to be. And the conflict continues on Mars for some years until, well, basically the media cycle moves on. You've got to look at things like Big Brother. I mean, those of us that saw Big Brother when it first came out, actually have I ever watched an episode of Big Brother? I don't think I might have watched half an episode of one once, but it was unwatchable in my opinion. But the first season, it was all anybody was talking about. It was massive, it was huge, biggest thing on TV. Second season, not so big. By season 5, who cared? I mean, it was barely even being covered. And they went on for a while, and obviously it's still being syndicated around the world, but fact is, our human attention span is limited, and we can't deal with seeing the same thing over and over again. And the colonial war on Mars jumped the shark. I haven't decided what the shark jumping incident will be. I'm open to suggestions, but something happened in the narrative that the media companies had concocted that caused the audiences on Earth to go, hang on, this isn't reality anymore. And at that point, they disconnected. And as soon as they disconnected, the media companies moved on. All the mercenaries fighting on Mars were abandoned. All of the money being pumped into the colonies to sustain the conflict dried up. And Mars was left to get on its own. At this point, Mars and Venus go in different directions. Mars was easy for me. I worked out Mars from the start based on how it would begin. The society structured itself around a corporation and around hereditary positions in the corporation, so that a child would inherit a position that was equivalent to their parents' position. And because people tended to mix with people that were in the same departments, you got hereditary castes of workers. So the leaders of society were called the exec. The people who controlled the finances and the markets and the currency were the fin. Then you had the army and the police were the sec. The intelligence services and the media were HR. And there are various other factions and castes within the society of Mars. But it's like a mix of a fever dream version of the Indian caste society like 200 years ago, mixed with a modern corporation, mixed with a healthy dose of republican democracy. So Mars is a democratic planet theoretically, but it's very much along the lines. It's a little bit like modern American democracy turned up to 12. So it's got all of the filibusters and all of the gerrymandering and all of the corruption and all of the worst aspects of modern republican democracy are alive and well on Mars in the future. Venus, meanwhile, has gone down a very different direction because life on Venus is practically impossible. The humans on the surface live deep, deep below the surface in cavern cities. And for them, the surface is a trial by fire. So it's a sort of a proof of adulthood to spend time on the surface. And Venusian young people will spend time designing their suits, planning their routes, practicing for surface movement, learning all of the challenges, and it gets turned into a kind of mystical journey. And for this I was... hang on, I've had another question which I didn't notice. Lack of actual coherent footage by resistance media, fake news by... yeah, exactly. You're with me. So it was inspired by a book I read, and I kind of both recommend and don't recommend this book. It's called The Secret History of the World by Jonathan Black. Jonathan Black is not his real name. I can't remember his real name. It's a totally barking piece of conspiracy nonsense, but it's kind of like the liberal environmentalists' conspiracy nonsense. It's very strange. I've read it several times. It's a very weird book in many ways, and a lot of it is utter garbage. I mean, it's entertaining garbage, but garbage. And some of it is tentatively historical and accurate. And the bit that I found most compelling and interesting was the section about mystery cults. Particularly sort of ancient mystery cults in the time of Greece and Rome. And a lot of what he writes is very speculative. He writes it as asserts as this is how it happened and this is how it was. Actually, if you dig into it, it's kind of guesswork. But nevertheless, I found it very interesting, and it very much inspired my idea of how Venus operates. And it operates on a system of mystery cults. So you join a mystery cult as part of your sort of growing up. And that cult will provide you with knowledge to understand how to survive your time on the surface, and they do so through various sort of mystical and metaphysical and metaphorical experiences that their members undergo, and each step they go through sort of inducts them into a new circle of knowledge. And eventually, if you go out onto the surface, you're sort of judged, your value is judged by how far you travel and how long you spend traveling. Most people will travel from one part of their cavern city to another. The very ambitious will travel from their city to the next city. The truly, truly exceptional will travel beyond the next city to the city beyond that. Now, all the cavern cities are fairly closely located in Mars, so we're talking about maximum journeys, I mean absolute maximum journeys in the dozens or tens of kilometers in a single go. Beyond that is impossible. The surface of the planet is far too hazardous. Most people only make it a few hundred meters at most, and that's enough to sort of qualify you as an adult. But if you have these sort of exceptional achievements, you become inducted into higher, deeper parts of your mystery cult. And the idea is that everybody is aspiring to go beyond the surface to the sky cities. And the idea is that all the different mystery cults have these different paths and these different kind of faith routes that all lead, they funnel through into the single path up to the sky cities. And the sky cities are sort of a representation of the inner circles of these mystery cults. And it's a pastiche on the idea that all of these, the Illuminati and the Rosicrucians and all these apparent secret societies and the Freemasons, they're all really funneling the same people towards, our lizard overlords or whatever you want to talk about, that they're all serving the same secret masters. And those are in the sky cities. And the sky cities basically rule Venus, because they're the only ones with any contact with the solar system outside the planet. And the sky cities exist. They're floating cities. They're a combination of antigravitics and hydrogen and helium balloons and whatever they can do. They got lots of hydrogen on Venus. The atmosphere is still incredibly caustic. It's still basically sulfuric acid. But at least the pressure and the temperature are manageable, so they can live in these self-contained domes, they can see the night sky and the stars, and they can access the orbital facilities around Venus. And as with all secret societies, there is always another layer. There is always an inner circle to the inner circle. And the inner circle to the sky cities are the Sky Masters. And the Sky Masters are those people who are allowed to leave Venus and travel in space. Now, the Martians do a fair amount of travelling in space, and even the Terrans have done a certain amount of travelling in space, but they send out, ships with crews of tens or dozens of people on them. The Venusians are different. They send out their ships with one person. All of their vessels are highly automated. They all contain one person. And the idea is that one person goes out on something like a spirit quest. So it's the space equivalent of the march that they do on the surface. And they have spiritual experiences in the deep silence and darkness of space whilst performing their missions of mining and trading and diplomacy and occasional espionage. But they also have these deep mystical experiences that they bring back to Venus and use to share with the other Sky Masters and teach to the other members of the inner circle. Whew, where are we at? 10 minutes, we're fine. Okay. Then disaster happens, and Amit hits Earth. There is no logical reason why an Earth as sophisticated and technologically advanced as the Earth we're talking about should get hit by an asteroid. They have their own space facilities. They have colonies in the transuranic asteroid belts and beyond. There is no logical reason why they should be hit by an asteroid. They should be able to intercept it, destroy it, redirect it. Easy. Should be easy for them, and yet Earth is hit by an asteroid. And the mystery is why, first of all. Colonies from Mars... rescuers from the Martian colony rush to Earth. In fact, there are already people observing Amit as it moves towards Earth from Mars as a scientific mission. They see Amit strike the planet, they alert the Martian homeworld, and they send rescue forces. When they reach the surface, they discover that the vast majority of the Terran population is missing. At least 90% of the population they believed was on Earth is no longer on Earth. And there is no sign of where they've gone. And it's a Mare Celeste planet. There is a tiny minority of people left behind. It's all those people that wouldn't join the meld, basically. Not exclusively, but predominantly it's people who either chose to live outside the city-states or lived in the undercities, between the cracks. It's about 10% of the total human population did not join the meld, and they are left behind. This is... this is drawing on a lot of stuff. If you've ever seen the Left Behind movies or read the Left Behind books, my apologies to you. They are dreadful, and a dreadful depiction of the religion that they're supposed to support, but it is an intentional satire on that idea of the idea that the Christian population will be snatched away into rapture at some point, undetermined in the future. So the idea is that they've been snatched away and a tiny proportion have been left behind. That's where Zero Dark's setting sort of kicks off. Venus is slow on the uptake, but they go to Earth as well. Both of the missions have ulterior motives. Venus is a little bit more open in their ulterior motive. They are interested in taking Terran technology. They are there to help a little bit. Mars is a little bit more honest in their intentions, in that they are definitely there to help. But once they realise that pretty much everybody who understood, owned or controlled the technology has gone, and the people that are left behind don't really know much about the world that they live in, all of a sudden it's a free-for-all. And the conflict is to control the left behind technology of Earth and reassert dominance on the solar system, fundamentally. It ends weirdly, and this is intentional, and we're going to unpack the details of this in due course over the life cycle of Zero Dark. But it ends weirdly because Venus kind of wins. Venus gets what it wants. And I've spoiled a bit of this in Operation Nemesis, so you can go and get that if you haven't already and have a look. Operation Nemesis reveals that, like I said, there's always another inner circle, because the Sky Masters have their own inner circle. At least it thinks it's the inner circle of the Sky Masters. It considers itself to be an inner circle, and they call themselves the Sky Lords. And the Sky Lords believe that they have received a revelation on the nature of what happened on Earth, and that this is a signal for something to happen that they are going to engineer. And for that reason, they need some specific things that they believe are on Earth. Why they think they've had this revelation, how they encountered it, again, I do not go into detail. I know, but I have not explained it. Maybe one day I will. But basically what happens is that Mars realizes that Venus is up to something. At least Venus realizes that there are people, the Venus mission realizes there are people within the mission that are up to something else. Mars is chasing Venus, then Venus is chasing their own people, the Skylords, and then everybody's chasing the Skylords, and the Skylords get away. Basically, the Skylords win. They get what they want, they return to Venus, and that's the end of their story. And Mars is left with the rest. So Venus has taken whatever they wanted. They won, they took the thing that they wanted, but everything else has been left for Mars, fundamentally. Now, there is still a very large population on Earth. It should be said, I said 10% of the population remain. That 10% of Earth's population is still larger than Mars's entire human population. We're talking in the realms of 500 million people. So basically, Earth and Mars kind of have a reunification at the end of that. Again, fairly vague because it takes a long time. One of the things that does develop in the course of the Zero Dark narrative is true artificial general intelligence. How is because of Terran technology. stuff that was left behind, cues them in, true artificial general intelligence is created, and that is the next step towards the next big technological revolution, which is the ability of humans to transfer their consciousness between bodies. And at that point, the whole nature of what constitutes a human begins to break down. And you have the ability of a human to place their consciousness into an artificial body that doesn't need a spacesuit, that can tolerate all kinds of pressures and vacuum. And so space exploration starts to explode. Everybody has multiple backups. We're talking about the post-scarcity society, essentially, because if you can take your consciousness out of your physical body and put it into an artificial body, all of a sudden you don't need to eat. You don't need to sleep. And it's becomes a more complex, more alien society. And I was very much inspired by some episodes of Doctor Who here, where this idea that humanity goes through a cycle of rediscovering itself. It slips away from humanity and then comes back and rediscovers the sort of the human norm. And that's very much sort of the cycle that goes through in what's called the solar hegemony. So this is the point at which Earth or humanity becomes, what do you call it, a level 2 civilization, something like that, where basically they don't create a Dyson sphere or a Dyson grid, but they could if they wanted to. They don't because they don't need to. But there are a lot of mysteries still kicking around. So society at this point becomes largely, it's very, very Ian Banks. I make no apologies for being hugely inspired by his work. But the idea is that human society is now largely governed by artificial minds. It is intentionally vague as to whether these are artificial general intelligence or whether they are somehow the remnants of the melds in some form. Have the melds vanished or have they returned in a new form somehow? Regardless, they are kind of guiding society. It's very benevolent, very benign. This is the sort of society that everybody expected. What do you mean everybody needs a Dyson sphere? Well, yeah, I know. Well, you can get to that. But basically, the amount of energy that a Dyson sphere would produce is more than the energy that the society needs in this vision. So they could do it, but they don't need to. The next thing that happens, the nice thing, and we're coming in the last couple of minutes, the nice thing in the solar hegemony is that anything is possible. So you have ritualized dueling, you have reenactments where people actually get shot because they've always got a backup body. And military reenactment becomes a big thing. So this is my ultimate get-out clause for the design of Horizon Wars. If anybody wants to just do something mad, they can set it in the solar hegemony and it's fine. But the hegemony does come to an end because they have a form of transport called the slap drive. And the slap drive is a form of faster than light speed travel. But it's very limited. If you use it within a solar system, you're fine. You can easily get around a solar system very quickly, very easily using the slap drives. But if you try and travel beyond the solar system, your accuracy becomes dire. And they struggle with that. But they send out a lot of probes to sort of find out what's out there. And civilization evolution model implies that. Yeah. It is Kardashev. I was trying to remember the Kardashev scale. Thank you, Christoph. That's exactly what I was after. And they send the probes out, and the probes find clues. And the clues start to make the solar hegemony paranoid. And at that point, they could have gone full Kardashev level 2 and built themselves a Dyson sphere. They elect to go the other way, which is rather than building a defensive screen and hiding inside it, they decide to leave the solar system and go and belligerently take on whatever they find out there. And that then leads us into the setting for Horizon Wars Infinite Dark, which follows on after that. And that's the end of the original Horizon Wars timeline. I've now extended it by about another 1,000 years into Horizon Wars Infinite Dark. But it's 3 o'clock, and I've been talking for an hour, and sometimes I've been talking to myself, sometimes I've been talking to my current guys. So hello, I've got Dale, I've got Christoph, I've clearly got one other person as well. Hello, third person who's being quiet in the comments. Thank you very much for joining me again this week. If you're watching this video later on, I'm always live streaming from Friday 2 till 3. There is a bell, apparently, that I'm supposed to point out to you. It might be there, or it might be like there. You can click the bell and you get a notification the next time I go live. Facebook desperately wants me to tell you to click the bell. I would like you to do whatever you please. I really don't mind. I'm here every Friday afternoon, whether you are or not. So thank you very much for coming. We're past 3 o'clock, so I'm going to go now. Thank you very much, guys. I'll speak to you again next week.